Hello everybody, it is January 24th, and that means it is Tuesday, and that means we are on Tuesday tutorial number 7, hope so, something like that, 7, and today we are discussing odds and probability in Pokemon. Now why in the world would I waste my time talking about something so boring? Well, Pokemon is a game of strategy and all that good stuff. It's also a game of luck. So with any card game comes statistics and odds and probabilities. So let's try to get to the bottom of some of those, and maybe you can kind of understand how your deck building actually impacts everything, and what to actually expect when you play a game, and whether or not you should get angry when certain things happen, or if you should expect things to happen. Guess we will figure all that out. And we are going to use a slideshow. I spent way too long putting together this slideshow. Talked with some people, mainly Jason Klaczynski. I also used a series of articles by a guy named Exact, who was actually from the small island of Malta. He wrote some articles on Pojo a while ago. I actually used to talk to him on the good old days of IRC, but I haven't heard from him in a while. But thanks to him as well for these articles. But enough of me talking, let's just jump right into it. There we go. There's my pretty slide, number 1. Odds and probability in Pokemon. We're trying to look all professional here. That is why we have crayons in the first slide. But, alright. So, first topic, pretty simple. Coin flips. It is an unfortunate part of the game. Well, it's not unfortunate, depending on how you look at it. Some people like that there's luck in the game. Some people hate the coin flips, but it is a part of Pokemon, so we will discuss it. So coin flips, basic coin flip. You know, when you flip a coin, you have heads or tails. That's what the H or the T stand for there. So you have a 1 out of 2 chance to get heads, which is 50%. And then I have a little formula there. Basically, for the sake of coin flipping, we'll do 1 out of 2 to some power, which the power is how many number of heads you flip, or how many number of coins you flip. So, if we're flipping 1 coin, then we'll do 1 over 2 to the first power, which is just still 1 over 2, which is 0.5 or 50%. So, when you flip 1 coin, 50%, that's your shot of getting a heads. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Not too complicated. I hope I haven't lost you by now. If I have, probably shouldn't be watching this. Alright, so, how about when we go for consecutive flips? For example, good old Cubone, everybody's favorite little Pokemon. You use Bone Rush. You flip until you get tails. So, how do you calculate consecutive flips? Well, we're using the same formula here. We're going to do 1 over 2. And then say we need 2 heads, we'll do that to the second power, which is 1/2 times 1/2, which actually comes out to 1/4, and then that's 25%. And then if you want to see how many you need for 3 heads, then you raise it to the third power, which is 12.5%, so on and so forth. This is pretty simple to calculate too. This is all you do when you want to figure out how many heads in a row you need, and what is the percentage that you'll actually pull it off. So every time I flip 3 heads in a row for Cubone, that should only happen 12.5% of the time, and I'm pretty lucky if that happens. So there is that. Pretty simple as well. Nothing too complicated yet. But even though this is true, this is a big topic. This is something that a lot of people don't grasp when it comes to coin flipping. This is called the gambler's fallacy. I flipped 10 tails in a row, so the next one has to be heads, right? I mean, I flipped so many tails, then I gotta get a heads. Eventually, the next one is more likely to be heads than it is tails. And let me tell you, that is not right. Coin flips are independent trials. That means no matter what you flip before, or no matter what you're gonna flip in the future, when you flip a coin, the odds of getting a heads is always 50%. So even though you flipped 8 tails in a row one game, you are not more likely to flip a heads just because you flipped 8 tails in a row. It's still 50-50 that you're going to flip heads on the next one. So, for some reason, people think, even though coin flips are completely independent of one another, that, the previous flips had something to do with it. And, this happened a lot when reversal was the big thing. You'd have 3 reversals in your hand, and you think, alright, I flipped tails on the first 2. This one's got to be heads. But that's still a 50-50 shot. That's just how coin flips work. When you're trying to figure out things for attacks, like for Cubone there, the odds are a little different because you have so many different combinations. But when you're just flipping a single coin, it's always independent. It's always 50% to flip a heads or tails. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. This is a lot of things. This is a thing a lot of people get tripped up on when we talk about coin flipping, and it's one of the main complaints of people. So just thought we'd go with that, and we have a cool old school picture of the card Gambler, known for being quite a horrible card. If you flip tails, you draw 1 card. 50%, you draw 8 cards. 50%, you draw 1 card. So, let's get into some other stuff. I have flipping exactly 1 out of 2 heads. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. Now, you can see here I listed out all the possible results. You can flip 2 tails, you can flip heads, tails, you can flip tails, heads, or heads, heads. So, 2 out of those 4 will result in 1 heads, and 2 out of 4 happens to be 50%. So, when you flip 2 coins, your odds of getting exactly 1 heads out of 2 is 50%. So, here we're going to present a new formula. The total number of combinations is just the number of possible results raised to the power of the number of attempts. So, for coin flipping, fairly simple. You have 2 possible results, heads or tails, and then we're going to flip 2 coins. So the number of attempts is 2. 2 to the second power is 4. Still pretty simple. And then we'll go to the next part. This might look a little complicated, a little tricky, but honestly it's just plugging in some numbers here. It's not too difficult. So here we're going to figure out combinations. This is just showing the formula for what we've already seen. If we want to go back here, we saw there are 2 combinations where you can flip exactly 1 heads. The heads and the tails and the heads. But how do I prove this? Just using math. Well, you use this formula here where n is the number of attempts and r is your desired result. So, if we have 2 flips and our result is 1 heads out of these 2 flips, then plug in the numbers to this formula. The exclamation point, of course, stands for factorial. So a 2 factorial would be 2 times 1, which is 2. 1 factorial is 1. That's just a definition. For example, if we had 3 factorial, it would be 3 times 2 times 1. But we don't have 3 here. We just have 2 and 1, just to make it simple. So we come out with 2 divided by 1, which is 2. And then we get 2 combinations of 1 heads. And then 2 combinations of our desired result divided by the 4 total combinations, which is 50%. So there we go, we just proved it. 1 half, 50%. That is your odds of flipping exactly 1 heads when you have 2 coins. But what happens when you want to flip 1 or more heads? Now this is a little tricky, and we bring our good friend Vanillux into the picture here, where you want to flip at least 1 heads, but you're happy with 2. You need at least 1 to paralyze your opponent, but if you flip 2 heads, you still paralyze them. The only thing you want is to not get 2 tails. So we can see here again, the possible outcomes are 2 tails, a heads and a tails and a heads, and 2 heads. So 3 out of 4 of those outcomes will be success. We will paralyze our opponent. 75%. Now once again we'll do the total number of combinations, which is 4, 2 to the second power. And let's move to the next slide where it gets a little more complicated. Now, I did maybe the more complicated route here. What we're going to do here is figure out the number of combinations where we flip 1 heads, which is that NCR1, and then we have to figure out the number of combinations where we flip 2 heads. So we plug in the numbers with the formula here, and we figure out that the number of combinations for flipping 1 heads is 2, and the number of combinations for flipping 2 heads is 1, and then we add them together. The total number of combinations that favor us are 3, and then, it's 3 out of 4, which is 75%. So 75% of the time we'll flip 1 or more heads. The alternate way to do this would be to figure out the number of combinations where we would actually fail, which would be 1. So 1 out of 4 times we fail, and then you would just take 1, you would subtract from 1, the probability of failure, which would be 25%. So you do 1 minus 0.25, which would be 75%. That's just the other way you can do it. I did it a little more complicated way, but that also works as well. But this is kind of the formula you would use here. And let's keep moving on. Of course, when we have Vanillux, we have Victini. He gives us another chance. And let me tell you, Victini causes a lot of headaches. People think in statistics or probabilities, you can just add the 2 results together when you're trying to figure out what happens on a reflip. Which really is not true for statistics. That's not how the formulas work, and we will try to prove that here. We'll dispel this myth, and we will go through the complication known as Victini and show you what your odds actually are when you flip, and then you flip again. So, there's the cute little Victini. So we're flipping again. Now we're going to assume that heads means success, tails means failure, and then how we figure out our probability of success is we take 1 minus the probability of failure to the power of the number of attempts. So, in our example here, where we're reflipping 1 coin, not flipping heads, which would be flipping tails, you have a 50% chance of that, but you have to raise it to the 2nd power just because of that reflip, and you actually have a 25% chance of flipping tails both times or not flipping heads both times. So when you flip heads, when you're trying to figure out the odds of trying to flip 1 heads with the reflip in mind, then you would take the probability of failure, which is 1/2, raise it to the 2nd power, which turns out to be 0.25. You subtract that from 1, come out with your number, 0.75, and you have a 75% chance of flipping heads with 1 flip if you get another shot at it. So, it's going to get a little more complicated from here. Coin flips are actually the simpler things in Pokemon, especially when you consider opening hands and drawing stuff and mulligans and all that cool stuff. That's actually the next section, but just gonna get a little trickier here, and we'll start getting into multiple coin flips and multiple reflipping. So, this is just for flipping a single coin, and then you get to reflip that single coin. So, this is the important stuff. You want to know what happens when you can reflip 2 coins, because, let's face it, all the cool cards have 2 flips in them. Now, Vanillux is the biggest one. He has 2 flips for double freeze, and also Sharpedo. He's a big one who has 2 flips. If you flip 2 heads, you discard your opponent's whole hand. So you want to figure out how likely is it that I'll get Sharpedo to work, how likely is it that I'll get Vanillux to work when I have Victini in play. So here, what we're going to do is, right off the bat, we're going to calculate, alright, what is it that you can flip exactly 0 heads out of 2 flips, which is simply the odds that you flip double tails twice, which is going to be 1 out of 4, raised to the 2nd power, which happens to be 6.25%. So, how do you calculate the other stuff? You want to calculate what happens when you don't flip double tails. What are the odds of that? So, here I have it worded as flipping at least 1 heads out of 2 flips, which means you can flip 1 or 2 heads. And that here is that formula I introduced in the last slide, which is 1 minus the probability of failure raised to the power how many trials you're running, which will be 1 out of 4. That is the probability of failure. You raise that, or you square it. That'd be a simpler way. I don't know why I keep saying raise to the second power. You square that, and then you take 1 minus 0.0625, which is 0.9375, or 93.75%. That, in fact, is the odds of you flipping at least 1 heads with Vanillix. Now, let's say you don't want to flip 2 heads. Maybe you don't want to knock out the defending Pokemon, and you know, if you did 80 damage, you would knock him out. So you want to know, what are the odds when I just flip exactly 1 heads? I want 1 heads. I don't want 0. I don't want 2. What are the odds of that? So here it's a little different. Our probability of failure is 1/2 because we can flip 2 tails. That's one of the outcomes. We can flip 2 heads. That's one of the other outcomes that we don't want. So 2 out of 4 of the outcomes, which is tails, heads, heads, tails. That's what we want. So you square that, which is 0.25. You subtract that from 1, and you get 75%. So your probability of flipping 1 out of 2 heads when you have Victini is 75%. And then we get to the good stuff. 2 heads. What are the odds that you're going to strip bare successfully? And that here, our probability of failure for that is 3 out of 4. So we square that, which is 0.5625. Subtract that from 1, and then we get 43.75%. So a lot of people actually think that Sharpedo with Victini is a 50-50 shot of discarding your opponent's hand, but actually it's 43.75% for Strip Bear to work successfully. So just clearing that up, because a lot of people have that false myth. And the formula here shows that actually it's under 50%. It's 43.75%, which makes a world of difference, which could explain why you're not getting it as much as you think. Still not a huge difference, but 43% compared to 50% is a pretty big deal. Now let's go and move on to a much more complicated thing here, which is opening hands. So, when you look here, these are 2 of the biggest things that people question with opening hands. If I play 1 Rotom and 4 Durant, how often will I start with just a Rotom? That is completely unfavorable. I do not want that to happen. So what are the odds of that? Also, I play 4 Pokemon Collector. What are the odds that I start with that in my opening hand? Well, let's find out. So these are some charts I found here from XX. Little article on Pojo. I have the link to them at the end of the slideshow. This is just the probability of opening with basics and how many. So when you're building a deck and you are deciding on how many basics to run, you can keep these statistics in mind. Just some things to note. You know, Durant normally plays 5 basics. 4 Durant, 1 Rotom. So, how often will that deck mulligan? It looks like about 52% of the time. 52.5 actually. So, that's a lot. Actually, more than half of your times you are going to mulligan with Durant. And that's just the way it is. And when you move up more, say we get to 10 basics, 1 in 4 games are going to mulligan, which is actually kind of shocking. You know, a lot of decks do play around 10 basics, and 1 in 4 games, just about, you're going to have at least 1 mulligan. And then, you know, we move on to like 14, then it starts to get a little less likely, 1 in 7 games, and you know, as the numbers rise up, then your numbers fall. But some other stuff to take note of is getting 2 basics. You know, what if you're worried about losing to a Zekrom deck on the first turn? Well, how many do I have to run to make it likely that I open with 2 basics? And the answer is really not too promising. I mean, if you run 10 basics, then in 25% of your games, you're going to open with 2 basics. Which, I mean, 75% of the games... actually, that's not true. I guess you could have more than 2 basics. But most of your games, you are not going to open with 2 basics. And honestly, even if you run, let's see, 14, then 32% of the time you're only opening with 2 basics. But actually, if you're running 14, then you're actually less likely to open with 1 basic than you are with more than 2. So I take that back. But the interesting thing I wanted to note here is, if you're trying to start with 2 basics, it's actually not worth it to run more than 14 if you take a look at the chart. Anything after 14, the odds are strikingly similar. See, if you want to look, it's 32% to open with 2 basics when you have 14 basics. And then even if you run 20, it's still only 32%. So if you're trying to open with 2 basics, then you really shouldn't run more than 14 unless you really, really want to. So, just something interesting to note. And I thought it was interesting. So you want to start with basics, and then you also want to start with energy. Now, I also took this chart from XX, little article series, but this chart is a little off. I don't think he calculated for Mulligans, which is something you have to do a lot when you're calculating for Pokemon stuff. But let's just look at it straightforwardly and see. If I want to start with 1 energy in my hand, how many do I have to run? So let's take a look. 0 energy in hand. If you run 10, 25, 26% of the time, you won't start with an energy in your hand. I would actually say it's more towards 25, probably lower than that. Just because, actually higher than that, sorry, because it didn't account for Mulligans. But you see, once you get to about 12, 14, 15, I would say most decks run about 12 energy, and you're still around 20% to not open with an energy in your hand. So you could still miss your energy drop first turn, even when you don't have that in your, even when you have 12, which is kind of shocking. Of course, you do get the extra card when you draw for your turn, so that changes the statistics a little bit, but just not having one in your opening hand, you're about 20%, even if you run 12 energy, to miss your first energy drop, which is kind of shocking when you think about it. When you get up to about 14 or 15 energy, then the odds increase quite a bit for you to have an energy in your opening hand, which I guess if you really, really want to drop an energy on the first turn, you should run about 13 or 14 energy. That's kind of what I get from this chart. Again, I don't know that these are completely correct. I'm just kind of taking the guy's word for it. He said he had a degree in mathematics, but these things are actually very hard to calculate just because of Mulligans and that kind of stuff. So, let's move on to the next one. This is where we get to the important stuff. You want to open with a certain card. So, let's assume that we play for Pokemon Collector. Now, the tricky thing about Pokemon is that if you want to calculate what are the odds for you to start with this Pokemon Collector, you need to take into account that one of those cards has to be a basic Pokemon. If it's not a basic Pokemon, then you have to shuffle your hand back in. So, it's not as simple as it would seem. You have to calculate for what are the odds that I draw this card, plus I need to draw basic. So, anytime you calculate for opening hands, you have to take this into account. And this is what makes calculations for Pokemon so annoying. You have this, and then you get prizes for later. So, we will take that into account here. So, we are just going to assume that the first card is a basic, because you have to open with a basic. And then from there, we do 1 minus, and then we calculate the odds of not drawing a collector in your next 6 cards. So, 55 out of 59 of your cards are not Pokemon Collector. So that is the first one. That's your probability on your first card, and then you just multiply all the rest of them. So After you draw your first card, 54 out of 58 of your cards will not be Pokemon Collector. So you do 1 minus the odds that you don't draw a Pokemon Collector. And then after that, we see that the odds of you opening with a Pokemon Collector in your hand is 40%. So, if you are opening with a Pokemon Collector in more than 40% of your games, you should feel quite lucky. This means if you were to play 10 rounds at a tournament, you would only start with Pokemon Collector about 4 out of 10 games, which is kind of shocking when you consider how important this card is in your opening hand. You know, Collector makes or breaks an opening hand. And even if you play 4, you're only getting it 40% of the time. So, there we go. That might be shocking for you. You know, you might think, oh, I play 4 of these, I should get these all the time. And then when you don't open with a Collector, you're like, well, this is stupid, I didn't open with a Collector, this is dumb, that's not how my deck's supposed to work. Well, actually, about 60% of the time, that is how it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to have a Collector. And that is just the cold reality. Now, let's see. This is where we get very, very, very complicated. Now, let's assume we are playing Durant, and we have 4 Durant in our deck, and 1 Rotom. What are the odds of opening with that pesky little Rotom? Because if we do, we're going to curse our luck, and probably lose the game. You know, we don't want to open with Rotom, so let's calculate, is it worth running Rotom in the first place? Will I open with it so many times that it's going to cost me games? And let's start off with calculating what are the odds of drawing Rotom in your opening hand. So, we multiply the odds of drawing Rotom for each of the 7 cards at the beginning, which 59 out of your 60 cards are not Rotom. So we're doing the same calculation we did before. 1 minus the probability that you do not open with a Rotom. And that ends up being 11.77%. However, that is just the start of our calculations for opening with a lone Rotom. Trust me, it gets a lot worse. This is the simple part. So, just drawing Rotom in your top 7 cards, 11.77%. Cool. That's pretty low, you know, 1 in 10 games, I can live with that. But then you have to calculate, hey, I can open with a Rotom and a Durant. So, let's calculate what it is when we already know we're drawing Rotom. So we take that into account, and then we see are our next 6 cards Durant. So we calculate what is the probability of a Durant being in our next 6 cards, and actually we calculated the odds of a Durant not being in our next 6 cards, I apologize, which is 63.34%. We multiply that by the first thing we had, which is 11.77%, and it's actually 7.57% to open with a lone Rotom. How cool is that? That's actually even less. I mean, you can open with a Durant by itself, or you can open with, a Rotom by itself, or a Rotom and a Durant, in which case, that's fine. We open with a Durant. We're okay. But it gets worse. You have to factor in Mulligans. The dreaded Mulligan, of course. Now, first we have to calculate what are the odds of us having a Mulligan in the first place, having no basic Pokemon in our opening hand. So, 55 of our 60 cards are not basic Pokemon, because we only run 4 Durant, 1 Rotom. So we do this same calculation that we've seen a couple times, and it comes out to be about 52% that we Mulligan. And now we're doing something a little tricky here. We already know that we are not going to Mulligan 0.4746. That's the probability of not mulliganing, because we're doing 1 minus 52.54%. So 47.46% of the time, we are not going to mulligan. And we know in that 47.46% of the time, that 7.57% of the time, we will not open with a Rotom. Okay? I know it's complicated. I'll just say it again because it's kind of tricky. So, we know 52.54% of the time we will mulligan, which automatically makes it so that 47.46% of the time we will not mulligan. And we've already calculated that when we don't mulligan, 7.57% of the time we will open with a lone rotom. So let's factor in what happens when we do mulligan. If we take that into account, then we can just figure out in total how much we will open with the lone rotom. And when we take that all into account, comes out to 8.38% to open with a lone rotom after you factor into mulligans. And then when we didn't factor in the mulligans, it was 7.57%. So in total, 15.95% of the time we will open with a lone rotom. Ugh, that's not good. So about 16% of your games, if you run one rotom, 4 Durant, which is 5 basics in total, you will open with a lone rotom. So this will happen to you at least once in a tournament, unless you're really lucky. 16% of the time you'll open with a lone rotom, which is not cool. So yeah, that might be a little surprising to you. That's actually over 1 in 10 games. So that is actually probably more likely than you would have thought. Just cool stuff you figure out with statistics. Might not be cool if you're playing Durant though. And alright, that was really the complicated part of this. The next part is just what can be in your prizes, and we'll use Durant again as an example. He's a good little helper when it comes to statistics, because a lot of the stuff revolves around him having stuff prized, or opening with bad stuff, or even opening with collector. So really everything just revolves around Durant, doesn't it? You know, this is kind of the second tutorial we've had based around Durant. I don't know how that guy keeps getting back in here. But anyway, this is just a thing in general. You know, after you draw your opening hand, based on how many copies of the cards you have left in your deck, this is what the odds are of something being prized. So if you run 1 copy of a card, 90% of the time it's not going to be prized. But 1 in 10 games, you will have a single copy of a card in your prizes. And then we look. When you have 2 copies of a card, then it's about 18.5% that one of them will be in the prizes, and extremely unlikely that both of them will be in the prizes, and so on and so forth. So you'll see, if you've ever run 4 copies of a card, and you've had all 4 prized, that is 1 in 30,342 games. And I gotta say, at my regionals, one of my opponents, he played a collector on the first turn, which was, you know, about 40% to open with a collector. Not bad. You know, that was pretty good. And then he played a collector, looked through his deck. He looked at me and he said, all 4 of my Tepigs are prized. So if you just want to check back here, 4 copies of Tepig, 4 in prizes, odds are 0.003%, which is 1 in 30,342 games. Not good luck. So, if you ever have 4 of something prized, you have a right to complain. Even if you have 3 of something prized, you still have a right to complain. 2 of something prized, you can complain, I guess. But, you know, it can happen. And if you have 1 of something prized, really you shouldn't be complaining. That happens quite a bit. So, this is just a nice little chart to see when you're playing certain numbers of cards, when you expect them to be prized. Now, this is actually extremely important when you're playing a tech 1-1 line of something. So, let's say I'm playing a 1-1 Sunflora. Now, let's just say I have 2 copies of cards that I don't want to be prized. I have the Sunkern and the Sunflora. So, 18.59% of the time, either the Sunkern or the Sunflora will be prized. So that's almost, it's about 3 in 16 games that a part of your 1-1 line will be prized. So that's kind of unfortunate. You know, like 1 in 5 of your games just about. A 1-1 line, part of it will be prized. So that's something to keep in mind when you're building decks. That's not always something you can rely on. So, I think that's all I have for now. That will wrap it up. My super duper rant and lecture on statistics, odds, probabilities, whatever you want to call them. If you want to double check and see where I got a lot of this stuff from, check out these links. The first one was Jason Klasinski's opening basic math, because let's be honest, I never would have figured out all the Mulligan stuff by myself. I had some help from him. He actually wrote an article about this quite a long time ago. This was over 5 years ago by now. So he's got all the formulas and stuff for calculating the Mulligans and the opening basics and all that stuff. And then the other thing I've been referencing the whole time is XX odds in Pokemon, which you can find at that link. Cool stuff. You should go check it out if you're interested, just to see I wasn't making this all up. So, thanks everybody for watching. That was my presentation on odds and statistics. Hopefully you learned a little bit of something. I know I did. And I learned how much of a pain it is to calculate probabilities for Pokemon. Mulligans make things horrible, and prizes do too. And these things are not friendly for probability. So, that will be the end of the normal show, and now we'll move into some question and answer. So, I'll just pause for a little bit, and then take some questions from the chat, and that will close out the night.